that's the only way you can really compare. And you can't take their charts and compare them very nicely. So these charts are normalized to a common plot. The dashed line that's black, the black dashed line, is an older silver screen, and the other colored lines represent silver screens from several different manufacturers. And you can see these are very high gain screens, and they still have a hot spot too on it. But the light level of the center light level is much, much wider before it starts to roll off. And so they're getting there. They're getting to better performance on these very high gain screens. If you drop the gain down to around the 2.0 level, then you start getting a little more uniform drop off towards the edges. One of these, I don't know which color it is, you have to study a little bit, but one of those is the real D screen, using a screen made by MDI using a real D particle. And then if you go into 1.4 gain, you see performance on all of these manufacturers have very comparable viewing angles. What I don't have in this chart is the stereo separation, and that's because historically manufacturers use linear stereo separation in their charts, when in fact what we really want to see is circular polarization. And so because I don't have uniform data to compare, it wasn't possible to show that, but I do believe we'll see a difference. And I think, and that's the case where you're going to see an engineered particle like real D's shine. So if you're an exhibitor, you have a lot of choices today in designing your room. And that's actually the key part here. If you have a narrow room, you can get away with a high gain screen. If you have a very wide room, you want to take some different steps. But cinema design is a lot more flexible today, and it will continue to improve because these guys all seem focused on trying to get to wider angles. They seem to get it that high gain is important. They've got to get to better response. And here we are. You take these screens and couple them with the highly efficient 3D polarized systems that are now available, and you can get a much brighter 3D image than what we are accustomed to on our screens. And that's without laser. So that's one of the important points to remember. It's not to say this intermediates laser, but laser won't be everywhere. We do need a wide footprint of higher brightness screens, and these are the technologies that are emerging that are going to help get us there. That's my presentation. So I have Keith, my next speaker's bio here in front of me. Keith Watanabe is our next speaker. He is the Director of Business Development for Cinema Equipment Supplies. He's worked in the cinema industry for 18 years with 3 different perspectives. First at Kodak, supporting the post-production community and finishing films. Then with digital conversion, through working with Christie Projection, and more recently working with Harkness Screens, who provided a lot of the information that we have on this show. In fact, let me do one thing. I didn't go to my last slide. Can we go back to my last slide? I just wanted to show. It's not necessary. I forgot to give my thank you to Harkness, to Severson, and to MDI for all the information and time that each of them spent with me in preparing this presentation. They each have a copy of the presentation. They couldn't be here because they're going to be at CinemaCon next week. And Keith was going to be our representative from Harkness, and then he changed companies during this, while we were preparing for this event. So continuing on with Keith, he serves on the Academy Motion Picture Theater Standards Committee. He's a member of the ASC Subcommittee on Laser Projection, and he was Harkness Screens representative for LIPA, the Laser Illumination Projector Association. In his new role as CES, he will be helping implement and develop software solutions to serve the industry. Please give a warm welcome to Keith Watanabe.
Good morning, everybody. Why don't you put my first slide up, please? Oh, it's me. crazy, isn't it? Imagine you're a crab. Imagine you're this crab. From the crab's point of view, do fish fly? It's kind of a perspective thing, right? So, my point of view draws on three unique experiences. My experience of being in Hollywood for about 7 years, closer to content creators, working with Christie Digital Projection, where for 5 years it was the US conversion from 0 to about 70%, and then working with Harkness Cinema Screens, the largest supplier of cinema screens in the world, for 3.5 years. So I've got three tales of perspectives I want to share today. And the titles are A Mismatch, Better, Worse, Better, or Standards Practice. So a mismatch actually stands for aspect ratio mismatch. As most of you know, the release formats for US motion pictures or for worldwide motion pictures are really flat, 1 high to 185 wide, and 1 high to 2.35 wide or scope. I worked for Kodak around year 2000 when it was really a heyday in Hollywood. Great time to be working. VHS was winding down, DVD was taking off. Hollywood was a great place to be. At the time, my perspective, born at that time, was that the mix was about half and half. The biggest summer films were, of course, scope, but the comedies, animation, dramas were always flat. It was always mixed about 50-50. I got in an argument. You ever get one of those points where you think you know something that's true and you take a really hard stand, later find out maybe you weren't right? Okay, I did one of those. And then because now most of them are scope now, Keith. And so I started doing a little bit of tracking. I took one of the industry trades, Film Journal, and for a year and a half, I looked at every review they had and logged whether it was scope or flat. It ends up that Thomas was right. The mix had changed, at least from Film Journal's perspective. The ones they chose to review was about 2-to-1 scope to flat. Thought that was interesting. I then looked at the top 50 performing box office features for domestic US in this past year, 2014. And I found something a little bit astounding. The mix was 82% were scope versus 18% was flat. Now, these 50 features represented 70% of the box office. So I went back, actually 4 more years, but I went back 4 years deeper than that, and it was always about 70% of the box office. These top performing films represented. But the last 2 years, it's been at this number, and it was about 70-30 in 2013, 2012. So here's where the mismatch happens. With exhibition, they typically, will buy a screen to one format or the other, to either fit a scope auditorium or a flat aspect auditorium, usually try to fill the largest they can. But I can tell you this, that over the past few years when I was working with Harkness, almost exclusively all the projects, and certainly most of the big screens, the premium large format screens, were almost always flat in nature, meaning that they wanted to get really high. I kind of call it the IMAX effect, where you walk in and they have this big screen right in front of you. So I looked at the factory figures. Our US factory, we've got several factories at Harkness, but there was a mix of about 25% was sent to Latin America and to parts of Asia, and it was all done in meters. So I kind of knew it wasn't a US figure. And then I kind of took the aspect ratios and averaged them both, and I found something interesting. For our international customers, almost always they were pretty close to the 2:3:5 aspect ratio, but the domestic US was kind of right in between. I had some data on some major publicly traded circuits. These are big circuits, I had data for 2006 through 2011, 5 years of data. Their average was 1.9. Very clearly, they're a flat aspect ratio kind of organization. I looked at another major circuit, different one, for all the screens that exited. We have majority of these screen business, and their average is 1.94. So one of the things that I thought was one of the mismatches was that why is the most successful, the highest grossing films all in scope format, but primarily it's being shown on flat aspect ratio screens. So here's a couple of suggestions. What if the studios or distribution released it actually in both formats? when they're going to try to get to HD and the downline screen for something like 16:9, 185 is pretty close. You could fill those big screens rather than have this enormous screen and then shrinking in the center. Okay, that's one idea. If you're the exhibitor and setting up a screen, you want to make sure that your scope picture is great, because that is where your bread is buttered. And then lastly, perhaps you can install in between two screens. Second tail, better, worse, better. So when we went from film to digital cinema, there was an improvement in the quality and light uniformity across the screen. So this is a 9-point readings. I participated in capturing both this data. And the one on the left that's on top of the film platter is the film, and it was a little higher because film standards were a little brighter. But you can see along the edges there, 68% on one edge, 69% on the other. There was a slight improvement to 76% with digital cinema. Because of the integrated rod, because of the glass reflectors, even the light path, we lost a little bit of light, but we gained in uniformity. So we got better. Then came 3D. 3D it got worse. So this is an example of a 3D numbers that actually I captured similar size screens. And you can see that from the center, it's actually less than 14. But look at the percentages. On the two left and right edges, we're at 33% of the center light. So we've got red hot center and kind of dark on the edges. Okay? And you can see on the left and right, you can see how it relates to film and what digital is. Why does this matter? Well, here's what happens. Is when you start to look at the targets that we've selected for 3D, the edges at a 50% or a 30% performance rate starts to get very low. 2.5 foot amperes, 1.6 foot amperes. And what I wanted to talk about was a little bit the human vision system and how we respond to light. So our eyes are set up, or the way we respond to light, we really have two big modes. One is daylight. And daylight, we've got great acuity, good color saturation. We have really good eyesight. The other, and cones are the primary driver of that mix. We also have night vision. It tends to be not much color, monochromatic, okay? We don't always see real sharp then, but we sense light changes and movement. I think maybe it stems back to Darwinian times, maybe to see predators that might eat us. Don't know, okay? But here's how it relates to cinema.